Firstly, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Dr. Jenikov, for that amazingly clear presentation, just what you expect from a surgeon. Also like to thank Presbyterian for hosting us, and Dr. Sharif, who's also our host, Dr. Patel, Dr. Ludeman, and Rabbi Fried from the Data Organization. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts with you about this type of ethical dilemma. I see that my visit is really needed here in Dallas, because since I was here 5 years ago, I noticed that you're still not learned to speak English with the correct accent. So we'll try to correct that if we can. I'd like to actually discuss with you a particular case which doesn't present the same dilemma as the one that you heard this evening, but presents in one way a much harder dilemma, and that is the problem of having to kill one child in order to save one. There's probably no more difficult question that can arise in medicine than that. Can you turn this down a little, please? Thank you. Thank you. I'm thinking of a case, a classic case that occurred in the Jewish world, of two little twins who shared organs in such a way that they would both not survive unless something were done. And really the only option that presented itself was to take the life of one in order to save the other. Right? You can probably think of no more agonizing or wrenching issue in medicine than having to kill somebody in order to save somebody else. And the reason we study this is because although it's very uncommon, and most of us will never see a case like Dr. Jenikov operated on, the principles that we derive from this case are very broadly applied throughout medicine, and in fact beyond medicine altogether. I'm still getting some feedback. Do you mind turning it down? Thank you. So let's take a look at this case. I'll describe to you the case in detail, and we'll try to think through some of the issues. I'm going to challenge you if that's okay. Am I allowed to do that, Rabbi Fried? And ask some questions as we go through, because you came here, I'm sure, to think and not just to sit passively. And for every correct answer to the questions that I'm going to pose you, Dr. Rabbi Fried's going to buy you a whiskey, right? Or cocaine or whatever you're into in Dallas. First of all, just a word or two about Siamese or conjoined twins in general. You heard this evening about a particular version of that where skulls and brains may be joined. But actually, it's a much broader problem than that. You know that, first of all, you get two types of twinning before we talk about conjoined twins, right? There must be somebody here as a twin. No? Somebody? Any twins? Probably. You get twins who are not identical, so-called fraternal twins. I don't know if you saw in the news, in England a few months ago, a woman gave birth to two twins, one white and one black. Okay? Interesting. But you do also get a situation of it during early stages of formation of the fetus, where the early blastocyst, the early ball of cells, divides into two genetically identical halves. Here's a first question for the evening. When the ball of cells splits down the middle and splits into two identical twins, are they in fact identical, or are they mirror images? In other words, you have a cleavage plane down the middle of that early developing embryo, before differentiation of the cells begins. Are you now talking about two twins who are truly identical, or are they face-to-face mirror images? Now, before you attempt to answer that question, you should accuse me of asking an invalid question. What's wrong with my question? What's wrong with this question? The problem with the question is, who cares? Who cares? In Jewish learning, you may never ask a question that's academic. The way the Talmud puts it is, l'may nafka min. In other words, we never ask a question when the answer is purely academic. Right? Or every Talmudic question always must have a practical outcome. Right? In the world of academics, we study things for their interest, but not in Talmudic study. And therefore, who cares whether the twins are in fact the same or mirror images? But I would not have asked you that question if it were not relevant. What's relevant about identical twins being the same or being mirror images? Can you think?
When they don't separate.
No. When you have two identical twins separated, okay, are they now the same as each other, or are they mirror images? What's relevant about that question? No? Any offers? No, the answer is this. If they're the same, they'll be the same. If they mirror images, one will have his organs reversed. One will have, right? And that's a very important question if you're a surgeon looking for the appendix on the right and it turns out to be on the left. So the question for homework is, I'm not going to give you the answer, I want you to have a few sleepless nights. But the question to research for homework is In identical twins, do you have a higher incidence of situs inversus, in other words, reversed organs in the chest or abdomen or both, in one of the twins? Can you see how that would be an outcome of this question? Okay, that's a fascinating question. But what happens is, at least one of the theories is, that sometimes in that separation you get an incomplete separation. And the twins remain fused at some or other part of their anatomy. You saw this evening an example of a cranial fusion, and there are many cases like that. I can think of two American women who must be in their 40s or 50s now who joined exactly like that in the time when they must be over 40 years old now. When they were young, it wasn't even considered separating them. Very rich brain interconnections. They're extremely well adjusted. One is a country and western singer. One is a nurse. They were interviewed recently, and one of them said she dreamed she was separated from her sister and she felt very lonely. Right? Very interesting. By the way, these so-called conjoined twins often share a closeness that is unusual. You know, where I live now in London, one of the largest series of separations of Siamese twins has taken place. The surgeon there, Dr. Louis Spitz, a very famous and excellent surgeon. He's a South African, of course. He has a very large series of separations. He told us that they found many years ago that when they separate twins successfully, they notice that if they nurse them in separate cribs, the children become distressed. If they put them back in the same crib close together, it helps the children settle. And not only that, when one child doesn't survive, they found that if they nurse the remaining child in a crib with a mirror, it helps the child settle. Right? Very interesting. But you sometimes get twins who are not so well adjusted. There are two Russian women who are in their 50s now who are joined from the waist down. In other words, there's one woman from the waist down and two women from the waist up. Right? In other words, they share a pelvis and pair of legs, perfectly coordinated. Each brain controls one leg, and they walk with perfect balance and so forth. They do not get on well. One is a chronic alcoholic, and her sister has liver disease. Since they share circulation, right, she drinks, the sister gets drunk, and they come to blows very often, but of course nothing can be done about that. This raises amazing questions. I mean, in Jewish law, one of the first questions one would ask here is that if one of these girls got married, can you see the issues? First issue, would the man be guilty of marrying two sisters, which is a prohibition in Jewish law? Second problem would be that in marital intimacy, there would be no privacy. You know that the intimate side of marriage in Jewish law, a lot written about it in a fascinating area. But one of the laws governing marital intimacy is that it must take place in private. You notice in the Orthodox world, people don't even show physical affection, husband for wife in public. It's a very private area. Here, you would never have private time with your wife because her sister would always be, you know, hanging on. I mean, she'd be there. And that would be a serious problem. A deeper problem would be that since in the lower half of the body, you're talking about one set of organs, would there be a adulterous element to the relationship since in one part of the body are vested two women? A fascinating question. And there are many other questions that this sort of situation raises. You can actually see there are two 18 or 19-year-old American girls who allowed themselves to be videoed, the Hensley twins. You can look it up. They have one body from the chest down and two necks and heads. Right? And they clap in perfect coordination. They can balance on a bicycle. In fact, they recently took their driver's test and they were made to take two tests. Right? Because each brain controls one arm. So they were made to take two driver's license tests, and you see there's no way they can be separated. And all sorts of fascinating variations. I saw recently in England two little boys, about 4 years old, joined by the sides of their heads, whose brains are richly interconnected. Each child can see out of his brother's eyes. Each child can see out of his own eyes, and he can also see out of his brother's eyes, right? You probably saw in the news a couple of years ago, two Iranian women were separated, 29-year-old women. Both died, unfortunately, during the separation. Their skulls were fused. They felt it wasn't worth living that way. They risked the separation. Unfortunately, both of them died. So you get all sorts of permutations and variations. But the one I'd like to focus on this evening is the question of where both cannot survive. Perhaps the most famous version of this took place in 1978 or 79, when an Orthodox Jewish couple living in a small town in New Jersey gave birth to two conjoined twins who were joined by their chests and abdomens. You know, we call them Siamese twins because, as David referred to, the original case of two Siamese boys who were joined by their chests. They were brought to England. They were exhibited in a circus for many years. They later emigrated here to the United States. They're both married, by the way. They're both married while joined. They used to spend 1 week in the home of the one wife and then both moved into the home of the other wife for alternate weeks. There are 11 children between them. and died within hours of each other. But that's the famous case of so-called Siamese twins. But these two little girls were born joined by their chests and abdomens. Right? And the first doctor to examine them was struck, they're born by cesarean section obviously, the first doctor to examine them was struck to find that he could hear only one heartbeat. And what turned out to be the surgical problem was there was one shared liver, but that was not really a limiting feature surgically. There were two separate gallbladders and biliary systems. It was clear that they could cut the liver, giving each child enough liver tissue. The problem was that there was only one heart, right? Only one heart. It was an abnormal 6-chambered heart, located more in the chest of baby girl B, right? I'm sure you're aware, not sure if all of you have medical backgrounds, but you know that the normal human heart has 4 chambers, right? Even in New Jersey. And therefore, there should have been 8 chambers to this abnormal organ, but there were only 6. And it was located more in the chest cavity of baby girl B. But apart from that, the anatomy was normal. The children were flown immediately to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, to Children's Hospital, CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where the surgeon in charge turned out to be Dr. Everett Koop. That's a very famous name in American medicine. He later became the Surgeon General. One of the fascinating features of this case is that the children were born to a very Orthodox Jewish family. Dr. Koop, as you're probably aware, is a devoutly religious Protestant Christian. Children's Hospital is a Catholic institution. And the case was heard in the High Court here in the United States, and I'll try to share with you something about that court case. But it's an amazing opportunity to see how these different religious, ethical, and legal systems look at the same problem. What was the dilemma? The dilemma was like this, that Dr. Koop said to the parents that if we do nothing, unfortunately both your children are going to die. The reason was that all previously recorded cases of this type had in fact died. In fact, 2 or 3 years before in Colombia and South America, 2 children like this had died. Children's Hospital had their hearts flown up, the fused heart, preserved and flown up to Philadelphia so that they could study what was likely to be the abnormal anatomy that they might find if they operated. You know, I don't have to tell you this is a surgical nightmare. To have to operate on this tiny space of 2 conjoined chests without knowing what features you are going to find is absolutely, is a surgical nightmare. You know, it's an old joke in medicine that different specialties attract different personality types. You know, the surgeons accuse the internists of being pipe-smoking thinkers who do nothing for the patient. I don't know if they smoke pipes anymore. And the internists accuse the surgeons of being knife-happy characters who will cut anything that moves. You know, there's a little truth to these stereotypes, and surgeons, generally speaking, are people who like to be well prepared, get in fast, get out fast, and do it right. To have to go into this unknown scenario is a very frightening prospect. So they had the heart flown up, and they studied it. But it was very clear that the children would not survive. The reason was that the heart was enough to support the circulations of both children at that age, but as they began to grow, it would become inadequate. And it was very clear that they would go into what's known as high output failure. The heart would fail. In fact, on the 21st day of their lives, they went into heart failure. They were put into intensive care, and it was very clear that if nothing were done, within a few weeks, for sure, they both would die. So Dr. Koop said to the parents, let me try at least to save one. And what he proposed to the parents was that he would separate the chests, he would separate the liver. He would then be the one with his own hands to tie off the major vessels of baby girl A. That means he would actually kill her with his own hands. If the heart continued beating, it didn't fibrillate, it continued beating normally, he would then carry the body of baby girl A to a sterile table they would have ready in the operating room, and he would then use her ribs to graft closure of the chest of baby girl B. In other words, leave the entire abnormal heart in the chest of baby girl B and close the defect using rib tissue and chest wall tissue from her twin in order to, and hopefully that abnormal heart would be adequate to support the circulation of baby girl B and she would survive. You can imagine the wrenching and agonizing nature of this question. The parents asked their rabbi, the rabbi asked his rabbi, and the question arrived at the doorstep of Rav Moshe Feinstein, probably the greatest halachic authority in the world at the time. He was in his 80s. He later said it was the most difficult life and death decision that he was ever required to make, and he made hundreds. And I'd like to share with you some of the analysis that he went through in reaching a conclusion about whether it would be allowed to take the life of baby girl A in these circumstances in order to save the life of baby girl B. By the way, why are we talking about having to kill baby girl A to save baby girl B? I can think of 3 or maybe even 4 better options. Can't you think of a better option than killing baby girl A? Anyone? Heart transplant, right? A transplant. Transplant? You know? Why can't we do that? Well, the reason that wasn't considered was because this case took place in 1978. The first time a newborn heart was transplanted was only in 1986. You know, heart transplantation is not that old a field. It only began in 1968 in a certain country. Of course, we needn't mention where that was. But by 1978-79, nobody had in fact tried to transplant a child's heart. So it was not even experimental. By the way, the first time it was done in 1986 was a baby born in Northern California. The surgeon was a well-known chest surgeon by the name of Norman Shumway. Decided to try for the first time to transplant a heart into a baby. What's the hardest part of transplanting a heart into a newborn? Where do you find one? They scoured the United States. They found a child available to be a donor in Vermont. But Vermont is 3,000 miles away from California. But since there was no other option, they hired a private jet, put one of the young surgeons in the team in this jet in California, flew him across to Vermont where he excised the heart of the donor child, put it into a box of cold cardioplegic solution, and they could not get the jet to start. They ended up scrambling United States Air Force supersonic fighter, put this terrified young surgeon in the back of a supersonic fighter with a heart in a box on his lap. When they got back to California, they had to resuscitate the surgeon, but they did, and they saved the life of the baby in California. Those were the lengths you had to go to in order to do that. But back in 78 or 79, this was not even experimental. So there was no option of transplanting a heart into baby girl A. Any other options? Say again? Yes, of course, Texas is the place to talk about it. A fully implantable artificial heart. You know, there's very exciting research taking place, and there's great hope that very shortly we'll have a fully implantable pump. For children, not so simple, but back in 78 it was early experimental days, and that really was not an option. The other thought, of course, is animal hearts, and there's research on that. But when you transplant a pig or a baboon heart, you know, rejection begins in 6 to 8 hours, and that's not a feasible option. And of course, the latest area of research is cloning one's own tissues, growing one's own organs and so forth. But back then, that was not even experimental. And therefore, Dr. Koop said, the only option we have is watch 2 children die, or let me try to save 1. Are we clear about the scenario? Let's go through some of the issues that Rabbi Feinstein went through. What I'm going to share with you is largely surmise, because he never wrote a formal responsum about this. So what I'm telling you is shared by members of his family. He has a son-in-law as professor of biology, a grandson who's an internist in Israel and at a hospital. They got together to give Rabbi Feinstein the technical medical input so that he could give a halachic, a Jewish legal ruling. Took 11 days of fasting and studying together with his family. He had the luxury of 11 days because the hospital needed that time to prepare for surgery. As Dr. Jennikov mentioned, there were amazing technical issues. I won't bore you with all of them, but they decided, as you said, to use 2 separate teams of anesthesiologists. And that raised unprecedented issues. For example, what would happen was these children have separate respiratory systems, but they share a circulation. So everything that one team is going to do that affects the respiratory system of one child will remain independent, but anything they do that affects the circulation will affect the other child too. They don't teach you that at medical school. So it took the hospital days in order to prepare technically for the surgery. There were other issues too. They asked the Muslim and Christian chaplains of the hospital. I actually had the privilege of giving a lecture on this case in Children's Hospital a few years later, and some of the Christian and Muslim chaplains who had been involved at the time were present, and I'll share with you some of their approaches to this issue. But although the Catholic priest who was there at the time authorized the surgery, many of the nurses refused to take part. Not on religious grounds, but they felt emotionally unable to go into an operating room knowing that they would see a child die, certainly by the hand of a surgeon. I don't have to tell you that almost nobody dies in the operating room, right? You can almost always at least get them out into recovery where it's somebody else's problem. You know, and to see a child actually killed by a surgeon is a very, very terrible thing. So the hospital put together a team of volunteer nurses and staff and prepared for the surgery. What were the issues that Rabbi Feinstein had to go through? Let's think through some of these. The first question, and I think you would see this yourself with just a moment's thought. The first question was, are these 2 little girls one person or are they 2? Do you see the relevance of that question? If we say that in fact these 2 little conjoined girls are one person, we're not in fact killing anyone, we're simply amputating part of a person in order to save, that's how we'd approach it ethically, we're simply amputating part of a person to save a person. In Jewish law, can you amputate part of a body to save the life of the person? Absolutely, it's an obligation, right? It's an obligation. Not that you can force a patient into that. There are limits to what you can coerce a patient into doing. There's a long subject in its own right in this book that I've just published. By the way, it's an excellent book. You need to buy at least 2 copies if you want to understand it deeply. But the point is that how far you can coerce a patient into accepting therapy is a fascinating issue. But there's no question that it's an obligation to sacrifice part of your body in order to have your life saved. By the way, in Jewish law, do you have to sacrifice part of your body to save somebody else's life? Do you have to give away a part of your body, a limb, an organ, to save another person's life? Well, it's not so easy to think of a case that doesn't also endanger the life of the donor. Kidney transplantation, for example, we take a donor kidney, a living donor, and we use it to save another life, right? There you're not only talking about the sacrifice of the organ, you're also talking about a definite risk to the life, a very small risk, but a risk to the life of the donor. What would be if you could think of a case where there'd be almost no risk to the donor? Fascinating case in the annals of Jewish law about 600 years ago. In Turkey, a Jew was accused of stealing by the Sultan. What is the Muslim punishment for stealing? This Jew was sentenced to have his hand cut off for this accusation of stealing. He managed to escape and he fled to Egypt. The Sultan captured another Jew, imprisoned him, and sent an ultimatum to the Jew in Egypt as follows. He said to him, if you refuse to come home, I'll kill him. If you come home, I'll cut off your hand and release him. You hear the question? So the Jew in Egypt went to a famous rabbi, Rav David ben Zimri, great Sephardi halachic authority, one of the greatest, in fact. We have hundreds, even thousands of his responses today. And asked him, Rabbi, am I obliged to go home and lose my hand to save another man's life? Or may I remain here even though he will be killed? Right? You should research this, look it up. It's fascinating. Ask Rabbi Fried to learn through the response. It's an amazing piece of work. He has novel halachic logic, which I'm not going to go into now. But I'll tell you the bottom line. He rules that if the man would go back and lose his hand, it would be an amazing mitzvah, tremendous act of kindness, acceptable in Jewish law, but not an obligation. Which means it's up to you. And in fact, we follow that ruling when it comes to kidney transplantation. Right? What we do with kidneys is we say to a donor, Jewish law regards this as safe enough that you are allowed to give your kidney, but risky enough that you're not obliged to. So it's up to you, which raises another whole area which we can't go into now in detail, but a fascination to give you one insight into that. What happens when you say to a family member, your kidney matches your brother? If you want to, we'll take your kidney, save your brothers. If you refuse, we won't. How does the person withstand the coercive psychological pressure of their family, looking at them and saying, how can you not save your brother? How do they make a free will decision without that extraneous pressure? The solution actually was proposed by a New York rabbi many years ago. It's now used throughout the transplant world. What happens is the surgical team interviews all members of the family privately. And when they speak to the family member who matches antigenically best, they say to them, you are alone in this room with us. None of your family are here. Our duty is to tell you that your kidney matches. If you agree, we'll take your kidney and save your brother's life. If you disagree, if you refuse, we'll never publicize that you matched. If necessary, we'll falsify the record. Your family will never know. You will have to live with the agony of the decision, but we'll remove from you the external coercive pressure of your family members. And that is what is done today. Can't always do that, of course. Sometimes people need to know. I don't know if you've been following the New England Journal a few months ago. They reported on a new series of what they call cross-transplantations. Do you know about this? Amazing thing. What happens if a mother, for example, is willing to give her kidney to her child but doesn't match? They find another mother willing to give a kidney to her child who also doesn't match, but who matches her. Mrs. A gives a kidney to little b so that Mrs. B will give a kidney to little A. The mothers agree, and they start the anesthetic at the same moment, so neither mother can back out. And recently they reported a series of 10. Mrs. A gave a kidney to little b so that Mrs. B gave a kidney to little c, so that Mrs. C gave a kidney to little d. 10 people received kidneys from somebody else's relative. Isn't that amazing? That's what's going on. Anyway, that's another area. So the first question is, if you say that these 2 children in fact are one person, then you're amputating part of a person. But if you say that there are 2 girls, then you're talking about killing somebody to save somebody else. What's your feeling? 2 children? 1?
So you gotta know what the definition is.
Right. Most theorists who've analyzed this case, both Jewish and non-Jewish, have suggested that if they have independent brains and nervous systems and virtually all the rest of the anatomy, we should probably look at them as two separate people, which makes it a much harder decision. But we'd like to find a justification in Jewish law for allowing surgery, even though we would define them as two people. And that's the line that Rav Moshe Feinstein took. But the next question is much more interesting, so stay with me carefully. Because here we need to explore some areas of Jewish law. And of course, our real motivation this evening is not to teach you about the ethics of Siamese twins. Rabbi Fried is just concerned that you'll take off a year or two from your practice and you'll come and sit in yeshiva and study Torah with us. It happens to the best of us, I can assure you. Here's the second question. Rabbi Feinstein sent a message to Dr. Cooper as follows. He said, you are preparing to operate in such a way that you save baby girl B. The reason was that technically that was the feasible way to do the surgery. The heart was more in her chest cavity. But if you wanted, could you reverse your decision? Could you rearrange all the plumbing, so to speak, and put the heart into the chest of baby girl A and sacrifice baby girl B? Dr. Koop said, ask the aged rabbi why he wants me to perform the surgically impossible. And he refused. He said, there's no way that even this way we have no idea what our chances of success are. It's never been done. This is a heroic attempt to save one life. I will not consider doing the surgery the other way around. Rabbi Feinstein did not want the surgery reversed. But he very importantly needed to know if it would be possible to operate in that direction. When he received the answer that it's this way or nothing, he gave permission for the surgery to go ahead. What lay behind that question? Let's try to think this through together. In order to do this, let's take a voyage through some halachic Talmudic areas and see if we can bring them to bear on the question. Here's the first principle. In Jewish law, we have a principle called the law of Rodef. Rodef means the law of the aggressor. And very briefly, what it means is if you see somebody trying to kill somebody else, all else being equal, right? We always study our ethical principle cases in isolation, all else being equal. And life is never like that, of course. But we isolate the principles this way. If you see somebody trying to kill someone else or rape someone else, either heterosexual or homosexual rape, then according to Jewish law, what is your duty? To stop him. Yes, and if you can only stop the person by killing him, you in fact are obliged to do that. Again, A is trying to kill B, all else being equal. The only way you can save the victim is by taking the life of the aggressor. In Jewish law, you are required. If you're not required to kill him, if you could injure the person, you may not kill him, right? But if you can do no option than taking the life of the aggressor, that in fact is what you're obliged to do. What's the commonest application of this principle? Not the medical application. What's the commonest legal application of this principle? Self-defense. When B is you and A is trying to kill you. So all jurisdictions in common law and certainly in Jewish law, you're allowed to preemptively kill the person who's trying to kill you in self-defense. In Judaism, that applies not only to yourself but also to any victim. You kill the aggressor if necessary in order to save the life of the victim. Second question for homework. What happens if you're walking down the street and you see A trying to kill B and you could injure A but you kill him? Is that actionable as homicide in Jewish law or not? And question 2, part B, what happens if A is you? And someone's trying to kill you, and you could injure the person, but in fact you kill him. Okay? Are you culpable for manslaughter, homicide, murder in Jewish law? Fascinating question. But there's no question that if somebody can be saved by taking the life of the aggressor, that is, if that's the only way, that in fact is what you're obliged to do. The commonest medical application, as you correctly said, is abortion, where the fetus threatens the life of the mother. That applies only before birth begins, by the way. Once the head is delivered during labor, or half the body of the child delivered in a breech presentation, then you can no longer kill the child in order to save the life of the mother. Then they have equal precedence, and you cannot kill one to save the other. But if the fetus is within the mother's body, not yet separated in any way, and the fetus threatens the life of the mother, then we have a very clear ruling in Judaism that the mother's life takes precedence, even if necessary, you take the life of the fetus. By the way, when I presented this case in Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, the Catholic priests told me that they rule the opposite, right? They try, if possible, to save the life of the child and not the life of the mother. Do not ask me questions about this. I have enough trouble keeping up with Jewish law. But I'll tell you what they told me. They told me the reason is, according to Catholic thinking, the child is born in a state of sin and needs to be baptized. The mother has already been saved by the grace of her baptism, and therefore it would be better to let the mother die because she's guaranteed a place in the next world from a Christian point of view. Whereas the child needs to be born to be baptized, and so that is not what we do in Jewish law. In Judaism, in fact, my father, who was a physician before me, who went from South Africa many years ago to study medicine in England, told me that when he was working at a very devoutly Catholic maternity hospital in Ireland, there were cases when he was attending a woman in labor, when the father would walk over and say, "Doctor, if my wife's labor becomes obstructed, I want you to save the baby and sacrifice my wife." Okay? These were not cases of difficult marriages. These were cases of Catholic law. Not that he ever had to do that. In Judaism, we are very clearly ruling that we'll take the life of the fetus if necessary in order to save the life of the mother. All the details, that requires a separate discussion, but that's the rule. By the way, this law can be very complicated. Example, 1973 in Israel, there was a case of some Israeli soldiers being fired upon by other Israelis in the Sinai. You know, they call this friendly fire, mistaken identity. So what happened was you had a group of Israeli soldiers in one location being fired on by another group of Jews at a distance. At a distance was a third group of soldiers who saw what was happening and could not communicate with either group. In this third group were some knowledgeable religious soldiers who knew the law of Roedef. The law of Roedef is that if you see A trying to kill B, and the only way you can save B is by taking the life of A, that's what you need to do. You imagine this tragic situation? And some of them wanted to fire at their own compatriots in the first group and kill them to stop them killing their other compatriots in the second group. They had a terrible argument about it on the battlefield, and they held their fire, and lives were lost in the first group. When they got home, they went to see Rabbi Yashiv, great halachic authority in Jerusalem. They asked him, "Rabbi, what should we have done?" And he said, "There's no way you'd be allowed to shoot. These are people doing what they ought to be doing in wartime under genuine case of mistaken identity. There's no way that you'd be allowed to kill them, and you did the right thing." Question 3 for homework. Why is this different than the fetus? The fetus threatens the life of the mother. We kill the fetus to save the mother, without no intention to kill. These soldiers are threatening the life of the soldiers with no intention to kill them. We do not kill the soldiers. See the question? That's a homework question worth a whiskey, Rabbi Fried, for any correct answer. That's a challenge. But that is the ruling we follow in Jewish law. When the fetus threatens the life of the mother takes precedence. Why are we discussing the law of Roedef? Because maybe we could say these little twins are Roedef on each other. Maybe baby girl A is, so to speak, threatening the life of baby girl B. Maybe B could say to A, "If it weren't for you, I might survive. You're an aggressor on my life." Maybe A can say to B the same thing. By the way, in Jewish law, if you see someone trying to kill somebody else, you're obliged to take the life of the aggressor. But if you see two people trying to kill each other, right? For example, you step out into the street in Dallas and you see two fellows with their hands over their gun. I'm sure it happens all the time here, doesn't it? I mean, isn't this Texas, no? And, you know, one of them says, "Draw," or whatever they say. And then they have to shoot. In such circumstances in Jewish law, you may not kill one. Each one kill the other in self-defense. But a bystander cannot do that. This is only in a unidirectional fashion when A is trying to kill B, not with mutual aggression. Could we find a way of saying that one of these twins is an aggressor on the other, such that we may take a life? That's the line of thinking. Before we get to that, let's add one more detail. What happens if the aggressor is one of a group? For example, we're sitting in this room and suddenly the hospital is surrounded by a group of terrorists. And they give us an ultimatum. The ultimatum is, give us one person to kill or woman to rape. Again, would be the same law. Give us one person to kill or we'll kill everyone. This is not an unrealistic scenario. This has happened many times in Jewish history, 70 years ago during the war. In Talmudic times, there are many examples of this. Give us one person to kill or we will kill everyone. What's the ruling we follow? And you know, we could make a very convincing argument. We could select a person and say, "Look, my friend, if you don't step outside, they're going to kill you along with the rest of us. Could you do us a favor and, you know, just step aside, right?" What's the ruling in Judaism? Not allowed to kill someone even though everybody dies. Even though the person would have died anyway, that's his problem, not ours. We are not allowed to do that. You cannot give a person to be killed or kill someone in order to save many lives. But what's not so clear is what would happen if they named the person they wanted. Do you see there's a different moral calculus here. If the terrorists say, "We want such and such, give us Finkelmovich," right? We've got a problem with Finkelmovich, we want to kill him. Here the person, this is called yichduhu, he has been designated to die. Not that we have to make the selection. In the first case scenario, who are we to make the choice? Why choose you or you or you? In this case, they've already made the selection. So now there's no question that we could have saved somebody else. Here, for sure, everybody's going to die. But the person that they want has already been named, and for sure that person is going to die. Do you see the difference here? What ruling do we follow? There's a fascinating precedent for this, again, without too much detail. The Jerusalem Talmud brings a case as follows. Any lawyers here this evening? Lawyers? In a group of doctors, they don't like to admit it, I suppose. The point is that here's the Jerusalem Talmud says the following thing. There was a man called Sheva bin Bichri who attacked King David. Now, in Jewish law, when the king is attacked, that's a capital offense. And the king has the right to summarily execute the person who threatened the ruling, the monarch. What happened was this man fled and he hid in the town of Avel. King David's army, led by the general Yoav, surrounded the town, and he gave them exactly such an ultimatum. He said, if you don't give me Sheva bin Bichri to kill, I'll kill the whole town. In other words, give me a specified named individual, or I'll kill everyone. In fact, what happened was a very old woman called Serach Bas Asher climbed up on the ramparts and began arguing the case halachically with Yoav, eventually prevailed on the townspeople to kill him. They threw his head over the wall, and she saved the whole city. So Talmud says, you see from this case that if the person is designated, after all, Sheva bin Bichri was named, if the person is designated, you may kill him to save everyone. Anything wrong with that precedent? There's an obvious flaw in this example. Yes, of course. He wasn't only named, he was guilty. So there's a fascinating argument in the Talmud about this. One position is that he was killed only because he was designated and guilty. The other position is he was killed because he was designated. He just happened to be guilty, but that's not necessary. This case is sufficiently differentiated from the first case where we must make the selection that you could learn a precedent for it. And this is an issue that comes down from Talmudic times, and it's a debate. The Rambam has an opinion on this, the Rashba, Rosh Shlomo ben Aderet, the Rabbi Barcelona in the 14th century. There are two positions in Jewish law about this case. One says that you can kill a person who's named only if he's named and responsible or guilty. The other position is that even if he's not guilty, but he's designated, that's enough. We don't follow that ruling, but there is such a ruling in Jewish law. Let's come back to our twins. Do you see the thinking? If we can say that baby girl A is an aggressor on baby girl B, after all, she's designated. She's the one who's killing baby girl B. B's not killing A. That means B could survive. There's no way we could save A. There's no way the surgery could be reversed. So we could not select baby girl A even if we tried to. Only we might be able to save baby girl B. So A, so to speak, is the designated party. She's the aggressor on B. We can't reverse that thought process. True, she's not guilty, but at least she's designated. That may be enough to allow us to take the life of baby girl A. Again, this is hotly debated. Many other Jewish authorities have disagreed vehemently with this way of thinking, although they concur with the conclusion. They disagree about how we get there. And many other questions were raised. Without going into too much detail, one of the young rabbis asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, he said to him, what if two people are coming down by a parachute? And one man's parachute fails to open, so he grabs his friend's leg. But due to his added weight, the parachute begins to rip. Is the man with the parachute on his back allowed to kick his friend off to a certain death? Is the heart like the parachute? Another young rabbi asked Rav Feinstein, what if two people are walking in the desert and one of them has a bottle of water, right? And there's only enough, this is a famous Talmudic case, there's only enough water in the bottle that if the man who has it drinks it, he'll reach civilization. Why you'd want to do that these days beats me, but if you did. But if you share the water with your friend, neither one will make it. You'll both live another day or two and both die in the desert. So what's better, to live a little extra, both of you, or to let one die and let the other survive in the long term? It's a fascinating argument in the Talmud. We rule according to Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that is that the one who has the water drinks it. Question 4 for homework, and this is worth a whole bottle of expensive single malt whiskey. What happens if neither one owns the water? You land there with a helicopter, you've got one bottle of water, 2 dying people. Do we then default to sharing it and letting them both live a little longer? Or do you give it to one and save one life in the long term? In other words, is ownership the issue? Or is saving a life the issue? Do I drink the water in the desert because it's mine? Or because the Talmudic logic is it's better for one to survive than two to survive in the short term? A fascinating question. Again, I'm not going to tell you the answer. Need to think about it. But that is one of the, and many other questions were raised, and eventually Rav Feinstein gave permission for the surgery to go ahead. Before I tell you what happened at operation, let me share with you an incredible incident that occurred in the courtroom. You know, Dr. Koop was concerned that if he operated on these twins, under Pennsylvania law, anybody could charge him with homicide for killing baby girl A. So he wanted a court order authorizing surgery to protect him and his hospital against a charge of murder. So in that year, they convened a 3-judge panel on Thanksgiving Day in a private, closed courtroom. A team of lawyers was employed in order to argue precedent in front of the judges, and they brought fascinating precedents. You know, there are many cases recorded in British and American law dealing with what is known as lifeboat ethics. People in a lifeboat, there was not enough food, so they starved someone, they threw someone overboard. There's a very famous case of the case known as the case of Robert Parker, more than a century ago. A lifeboat was drifting in the South Pacific with 3 men on board after a shipwreck. The captain, first mate, and a young cabin boy called Robert Parker. After 3 weeks in a lifeboat with no food, the 2 older men decided to kill him and eat him. They killed Robert Parker and ate him and survived. When they got back to Britain, they admitted what they had done and they were charged with murder. And it's a fascinating case. It's a well-known precedent in British and American law. Are you allowed to kill somebody to save other people's lives? Does it fall under maritime law? Fascinating question. So many of these cases were raised, and the judges eventually accepted that it would be better to allow surgery, and they authorized surgery, and the hospital was protected. But there was an amazing incident that took place in the courtroom. And if this doesn't move you, there's no hope for you. So stay with me. Do you know that one of the most difficult issues in medical ethics, and in Jewish medical ethics, what is the definition of death? What moment defines death? Today, throughout the United States and virtually all the Western world, we categorize it as brainstem death. In Jewish law, that's not so simple at all, by the way. Not at all a simple matter, but that's a question for another time. However, back in 1978, 79, the definition of death in Pennsylvania was cessation of spontaneous heartbeat. A President's Commission sat in 1980 and recommended the acceptance of a brainstem death definition. But back in 78, that was not the definition. The definition was cessation of spontaneous heartbeat. When the patient's heart stops beating, the patient has died. So here's what the lawyers said to the judges. They said, look, you're going to take this heart and leave it beating in the chest of baby girl B. Well, if no heart stops beating, nobody's dying. Isn't that amazing? This means, of course, if you didn't like someone, you could hack their heart out, keep it ticking in your lab, dispose of the rest of them in small pieces, and you wouldn't be culpable for murder because no heart stopped beating. Right? This is what you call a loophole. Right? The judges threw it out. In the American idiom, they said that may be the letter of the law, but it ain't the spirit of the law, and they threw it out. But what's amazing in that democracy, people make up the law as they go along. You get weird scenarios like this. In Jewish law, which comes from another place, you don't have that sort of situation. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, one of the great rabbinic thinkers of the last century, said it very beautifully. He said, in a democracy, the people make the law. In Judaism, the law makes the people. Anyway, the court authorized surgery, and in fact, that is what happened. I'll tell you briefly what happened, and I'll stop for questions. What happened was they, in fact, operated on the children. The chests were opened, the liver was successfully separated. Dr. Coop, in fact, insisted on being the one to tie off the vessels of baby girl A. Of course, she died immediately. He carried her body over to the table. They never needed her ribs because they were able to get the chest tissue closed with normal anatomical relations, breast tissue in the normal place and so forth, without needing ribs from baby girl A. And he gave the body of baby girl A back to the family the same day. They could bury her before sunset on the same day. And people present said it was an amazing experience for the Jews and the non-Jews involved to go through the steps required by Jewish law at the hands of a very elderly sage of the Jewish people. And that, in fact, is what happened in this case. I'm going to stop here in case you have any questions, and I'm happy to answer if I'm able to. Before I do that, can I leave you with one last question? This is for a very expensive choice whiskey. Are you game? Oh, you look very enthusiastic. Okay, listen well. Here's my question. 1950-ish, a man was driving his car down the Carmel mountain in Haifa. You've been there? It's a very, very steep mountain. When the brakes failed. In fact, this was an Israeli car. I'd never used the brakes before. Just used the horn. Anyway, the point is that he found himself careening towards a bus stop in which 10 people were standing. Failed brakes, no fault of his own, about to wipe out 10 people. He could turn away from them, but unfortunately only to a place where one person was standing. What should he have done? Nothing and wiped out 10, or turn and kill one? What would you say? I don't know what he did, but people went to ask the Chazon Ish, the great rabbinic authority. After this incident, they went to ask the Chazon Ish, great rabbinic authority in Bnei Brak, he died in 1954, Rabbi, what should the man have done? And the Chazon Ish said, I think he should have turned and killed one man. They said, Rabbi, doesn't that contradict what we learned this evening? We learned that if 10 people are in a room being threatened, you may not kill one to save 10. And he showed them the difference between these cases on purely logical grounds. Again, they are completely parallel cases. What's the difference? Again, my car is about to wipe out 10 people. I do nothing, sit there passively, 10 die. I kill one, save 10. Should I do that? Yes. Terrorists are about to wipe out 10 people. They give me a high-powered rifle. They say, Tatz, shoot that innocent bystander. You kill him, we'll save 10. May I kill him? No. But why? They're exactly parallel.
Somebody has to
One,
die. regardless.
in both cases. In both cases, if I do nothing, 10 die. But if I kill one, I save 10. Exactly the same.
In one you're doing the killing, and in one you'll do the killing.
In both cases, I'm doing exactly the same. I'm driving my car and killing him. I'm shooting him with the gun and killing him. And saving 10. They're exactly parallel.
In the second,
I've got a choice in both cases. In both cases, I can do nothing passively and have 10 die, or kill one and save 10. They're exactly parallel. They're both identical. There's 10 people in front of me and one innocent party on the side. In both cases, exactly the same.
Terrorists can say the same thing again and again.
The terrorists are going to do this without me. Right? That's beyond my control.
The choice is in the driver's hands, not the...
In both cases, he has the choice.
No, instead of the group's hands... Or
No. In both cases, I have the choice. Either I turn my car and kill one or I do not. In the second case, I shoot one or I do not. I have a choice in both cases. You're not doing very well. Would you like a clue? Here's a clue. I'm not giving you the answer, but I'll give you a clue. Here's a clue. I'll give you another 2 cases that relate in the same way, okay, but I think more clearly. Here they are. You're standing at the side of a railroad track, and an express train's coming down the line. Beyond you, 5 people are standing on the track. If you do nothing, 5 will be wiped out. If you quickly pull the points, you'll change the track, and the train will turn onto a new track where there's 1 person standing. What should you do? Stand there passively and watch 5 people killed, or divert the train and have it kill 1? If you think you should divert the train, raise your hand. Okay, more than 90% of Americans surveyed say the same thing as you. Scenario number 2. You're a doctor in a hospital. You have 5 patients in organ failure. The nurse walks in and says, Doctor, there's a young man come to visit his mother. Let's cut his throat. Take 5 organs and save 5 lives. Hands up if you feel we should do that. Exactly the same. Exactly the same. And if you don't like cutting his throat with your hand, you could pull a lever that does the same thing and eventually... Exactly the same. Why in the train were you so convinced that you should cause 1 to die to save 5, and in the second case you wouldn't accept that? It's exactly parallel.
The second case can become policy.
And the second case, my car.
but in one case,
In both cases, not me. It's a passive non-action.
but in one case, the one person's already in danger.
In both cases, they're exactly the same. There's an innocent bystander, completely out of danger, and 10 people being threatened. They're exactly the same. Okay, let's have questions on other subjects, and you can think about this tonight instead of sleeping. Yes?
I think the intent is different.
Intent is to save 10 people very clearly in both cases. I would never do this other than saving 10 people. Let's have questions on any... Yes? If you buy 3 copies and read it very... and read very carefully, then you... Any questions about what we discussed this evening for Dr. Jenikov or myself? If I can answer, I'm happy to. Yes, please.
What would have happened if they had shared the heart equally?
So according to tonight's analysis, we would not... The question here was, what if the choice had been the heart was centrally located, they shared it equally? According to tonight's logic, and again, it's not the only way to approach this case, we would not be allowed to interfere. Okay? Like when the mother's giving birth, the child begins to be born, and they each threaten each other, we cannot kill one to save the other. So there we would not be, according to this logic that we said this evening. This case hinged, according to this way of thinking, on the fact that A was really an aggressor on the life of B, possibly even not defined as fully alive because she didn't have a heart. That might be another thing we call like a stillborn child. There are other ways to think about it. But according to this, she's the one-sided aggressor, so to speak, on the person hanging onto the parachute who doesn't have his own, so to speak. That's the way to... Yeah, are there any other questions that I can... You have to earn your credits, you know? Yes.
What do you do with fetal reduction if a woman's carrying 8 fetuses?
Good question, yes. In fetal reduction, the question was, what about a woman who's pregnant with, let's say, 6 or 7 or 8 fetuses in such a way that they will all die or most of them will die, and we can do what's known as a culling or a fetal reduction. There is a chapter in my book about that, and there are other books about that as well. In fact, in Jewish law, it's acceptable to cull 1 or more children, the minimum number needed to give the rest a chance of survival. Okay? Which one should you cull? So the one that's technically feasible with the least risk to the others. Okay? If there would be no difference, let's say you could take one of 2, and one were a boy and one were a girl, you could probably choose which one you wanted. Okay, there's no precedent in Jewish law for saving a boy over a girl or vice versa, and therefore that might be in reproductive technology today, when I think Dr. Patel is here, he's an expert in that field. Sometimes we find ourselves with a number of embryos where we want to reimplant into the fertilized embryos, we want to reimplant into the uterus 1 or 2, and we have 3 or 4 or 5. There we may select the sex, right, if we are going to limit the selection anyway. Let's say the couple already has boys, they don't have any girls. There's no reason in Jewish law. We wouldn't allow this reproductive technology to be used to select sex only in the first place, but once you've done it to exclude a genetic disease and now you can make a selection, all else being equal, there'd be nothing wrong with that. Are there other questions? Yes, please.
When does life start?
When does life start? That's not clear. I'll say this. The practical application of that is doesn't mean you could do an abortion. Okay. In Jewish law, abortion is forbidden. We will break the Sabbath or do virtually any other prohibition in order to save a pregnancy at any stage. However, although that's true, the mother's life takes precedence. So at any stage of pregnancy, certainly before 40 days of pregnancy, but even after that, the mother's life takes priority. There's a classic ancient Jewish source called the Mishnah that says even if you have to dismember the fetus in the womb, although it's alive, and it is a human being, and we would break the Sabbath to save it, yet the mother's life takes precedence. Maimonides rules it's because the fetus is an aggressor on the life of the mother, which needs a lot of discussion, but that's how we do. Technically, the Kabbalistic perspective on your question is, at the moment of conception, life begins. That means the soul is invested in the child. At the moment of birth, the child gets what's called a yetzer hora. That means a negative inclination, as how you put it in English, but a vested interest, Say again?
Evil inclination.
Yeah, it gets the childish, self-interested, I'm what counts. And at bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, he gets what's called a yetzer tov. In other words, a moral ability to weigh things morally, gets the, so to speak, the good side, the spiritual side. He can make moral decisions, and that's why a child's not culpable before bar mitzvah. Yes, please.
When is the surgical risk considered so high that it will be shortening the twins' lives and it will not be allowed?
That's a very good question. So that is the main subject of this book that I wrote, which is the question, how do you define risk and weigh risk medically and surgically? Really, that's a question of judgment. A very clear cutoff would be a 50% level. In other words, let me put it to you like this. The classic application of your question, which we see every day in medicine, not in Siamese twins, what happens when you have a person whose life is threatened by some disease which inevitably will kill the person in the short term, which in Jewish law means within a year? That what we call terminal for purposes of this discussion would be a person dying within a year, without any question about that. But we can offer them a dangerous procedure which, if it works, will save their life in the long term, but fails, will kill them tomorrow morning during the procedure. How risky does it have to be before we are not allowed to do that? In other words, we do nothing, the person will certainly die. We can offer them a procedure which may save them in the long term, but may foreshorten their life and take away the 3 months or 6 months or 9 months they would have had. The ruling we follow in that case, again, it's a long discussion, a fascinating background, fascinating precedents, but the ruling we follow is that even if the risk is very high, because the alternative is certain death, that risk is acceptable. Now, how much risk? By the way, the ruling we follow in practice is the patient gets to choose, which happens to accord with modern medical ethics, even though our way of arriving at that conclusion is not the same. We say to the patient, do you wish to live for 6 months, 9 months, and then prepare yourself and then die? Or do you want to take a risk of a procedure tomorrow morning that may save your life, but you may not wake up from the procedure? If the risk of the procedure is less than 50%, in other words, the mortality of this procedure that we're considering is high, but less than 50%, that means the preponderance of chances are the person will survive, they ought to undergo the procedure. No way you can force them, it's certainly their own choice, but the default position in Judaism is it's better to take a chance that's better than 50% of living in the long term, rather than certain death within the short term. The ruling we follow today, according to many major Jewish authorities, is that even if the risk is greater than 50%, that means there's only a much smaller chance the person will survive. The overwhelming probability is they will not survive the procedure. It's still permissible in Jewish law. So if you say to the patient, there's only a 20% chance of your surviving tomorrow's procedure, right? 80% chance of dying. But the alternative is certain death. It's perfectly acceptable in Jewish law to undergo the procedure. How small does that have to get before it becomes prohibited is a matter of opinion. There are those who say even 10%, perhaps even less than that, and that needs rabbinic wisdom and judgment in each case, but that's the ruling that we follow. It's a very common scenario today to say to a patient, we can offer you a massive chemotherapy and marrow ablation and rescue marrow transplantation, very high mortality, but certain death as an alternative. By the way, it's very important to know that's only where death is certain as an alternative. Where you don't know what the alternative is, the Jewish position is very clear that it's better to do nothing and see harm result than cause the harm yourself. Is that clear? In other words, you have a person who is, you don't know if they're in danger or not. You don't know if they're dying and an action will save them, or they're holding on and an action will kill them. If the chances are equal, let them die because you failed to save them, then die because you killed them. Is that clear? Again, you're walking down the street, you find a person who's been injured. His neck's, at a crazy angle and he's breathing with difficulty. Should you gently put some traction on his neck and straighten it and you'll save his life? Or possibly when you do that, you'll kill him? If the chances are 50-50 either way, don't touch him. Let him die because you failed to save him, than because you killed him. Again, we're talking where you're not affecting his chances at all. It's a 50-50 chance that he's surviving without you and you'll kill him, or a 50-50 chance that he's dying and you'll save him. Is this clear? So the first principle in Jewish law, in the non-Jewish world, we call this first do no harm. This is the Jewish technical translation of that principle. Right? And medicine often presents you with those sorts of circumstances where you don't know whether your action will be life-saving or killing. In such circumstances, don't do it. But where certain death is the alternative, then you can do even very risky things in order to give the person the chance of survival. Yes. Sorry, that's only where the patient opts for it. Right? He gets the choice. What happens if he cannot make a choice, like it's a child, an unconscious person? The default position is we ask the family. The reason is, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, most people trust their families to act in their best interest. We talk about normal families, not people, hovering around waiting for the inheritance or problems like that. And we very often see families where there are internal conflicts. It's a very real problem. The problem I'm often faced with is a parent who's desperately ill, where members of the family, some happen to be religious and some are not. Or the parent is not religious and the kids are. And you have very different worldviews, and that's a big problem. But in normal circumstances, we ask children what they want for a parent or parent for a child, where we have reason to suppose that they would in fact trust that proxy's decision. If there are no family to ask, then we default to asking what most people in that circumstance would want. Right? For example, if a child is born with multiple abnormalities and can be saved by many surgical procedures with great pain, and even then would only survive for an extra couple of months, probably most people would say we wouldn't want that, and so we default to what that common opinion would be. Yes, please.
Based on this argument
yes.
you just made, on many of these conjoined twins
yes.
that we're seeing,
yes.
we see many that have lived a long period of time, like those Iranian women who were 29 and then decided to be separated and died.
Yes.
And we see a 50% mortality, and we see even a greater percent that have neurological defects.
Yes.
So it would seem that the argument is not to separate them.
I think you're right. I think that if we're talking about a greater than 50% mortality, and the alternative is living joined, although that's a great discomfort and seriously limiting thing, The default position probably not be. But if you were convinced that there's a less than 50, that means your chances of their survival is greater than 50, that possibly becomes the default.
The problem with these very rare cases
Yes.
is we as physicians don't really know
Yes.
what their chances are.
Yes.
Obviously, their life is not going to be normal,
Yes.
but we don't know what the real outcome is going to be for all.
Yes.
You know, many of them don't die, and we've seen many examples today. People
Yes.
who live into their 20s,
Yes.
30s, and have even functional lives. One was a country western singer. I know you're not very proud of that, but
Yeah.
but the truth is that they can live, and the question to make that decision to separate them often falls on the physician.
Yes.
And so I wanted to know ethically what you thought we should do when we have these concerns.
You know, this is like much of medicine, good judgment. And even with inadequate background information, we have to make those judgment calls. The default would generally be that if we don't know whether the chances of survival or death are which is greater, or we have reason to believe that the chance of non-survival is greater, the default position would be probably not to do this. You know, what more can we say? Any final question before we... Yes, please. Yes.
Is the issue of separating conjoined twins or doing something surgically in utero before they're actually born, is that any different than doing it after the fact that they're born?
The question was, is there any ethical leniency to trying to operate on conjoined twins in utero? You know, I'm not sure it's a really practical question today, although the intrauterine procedures are getting much more advanced and much more of them. I'm not sure. This is such complex surgery. Here you heard about a case that took more than 30 hours, right, for separation. And the anatomy is incredibly complex sometimes, not only with heads joined, but even bodies joined. Very often you have ureters implanting into each other's bladder. Amazing anatomical. So I'm not sure that's realistic. Probably it would be a bit more lenient. And I think the real question there would it be best for them? In other words, could we do the intrauterine procedure in such a way that it would be better for their survival? Today, probably that would not be the case. By the way, we're almost now seeing none of the... It's very rare that you see these cases now. The reason is because with antenatal screening, the children these are detected long before they get to the stage you saw there. The cases we're seeing now are either from Catholic countries, where they don't abort such pregnancies, or the third world, where the screening is inadequate. In such cases, but in the developed world today, almost, these cases are exceptionally rare. So that large series to build up experience are almost probably never going to happen again. Yes, last question, please.
Curious, in this particular case, and it turned out well.
Yes.
But saying, doing the proper kind of evaluation maybe should not have been done because the odds were against it.
I'm not sure the odds were against it in this case. And an assessment was made.
Before the fact, there was 20% chance
Right.
of success.
But if I may say so, the question here was, in this conjoined case that we saw by Dr. Janikov beforehand, what was the justification for operating when they think that the survival was probably 20%? My impression is, you could ask him this, but my impression is that although that was the historical record going back a long time with the incredibly more advanced facilities and technology that they had here, they made a judgment call that they thought they could do a lot better than that, right, with incredibly detailed anatomical studies and so forth. And in fact, they were right there. Probably if you said that the survival here was only 20%, you could make an argument that possibly should not be done. Now, there's overwhelming possibilities you're going to kill the children rather than save them, then possibly not.
The allocation of resources.
Okay, the question that I'm not going to answer, if you don't mind, is what about the problem of allocation of resources? That requires another amazing, detailed discussion. How do we prioritize? Yes, it was an incredible number of man hours, woman hours, money, etc. How do we prioritize scarce resources in Jewish law? There's a major section in this excellent book that deals with that. Or if you invite me some other time, I'm happy to come and talk about it. Thank you very much for this.